All right. Did you all hear that? Okay. So welcome. And one of the things I thought we might do today, first of all, is talk a bit about the concept of equanimity and how that shows up in our practice. So I think it's an important theme. It's an important topic, not just for our meditation practice, but in how we might actually find some stability during the times that we're in, uh, and also how to relate perhaps to some of the things that come up for us, whether it's around the virus or if just kind of the general stress around where we are in the world right now sort of seeps into our own other issues in our lives. Equanimity is one of those things that is, we may hear it from time to time, but it's a little obscure, I think, and often in how it's talked about. And so, what I thought we might do is just talk a bit about equanimity and what it might mean, um, both in our view, our outlook, as well as in our practice. And in what's called the Indriya Bhavana Sutra, which is the Buddha's teaching on equanimity from the Buddha himself. Uh, Equanimity is seen to have the characteristic of water dropping on a lotus leaf. And if you've ever noticed, it doesn't have to be a lotus, of course, it could be any plant, but if you've ever seen water kind of fall onto the leaf of any kind of plant or flower, uh, it doesn't soak into the leaf, but rather it almost rolls right off, right? It falls and then it kind of rolls away. And in a way, that's what the Buddha, when he teaches us that equanimity is just like a drop of water landing on a lotus leaf. This is peacefulness in equanimity. This notion of things that basically arise, that the products of the mind, the narratives, the spin, the reactions that come, can be like those drops of water that really have no stickiness to them as much as we might feel like they do. The key there is how we relate to what comes up. The stickiness is really in our own sort of holding on, grasping, and clinging to things as they arise. And so, but the things in and of themselves largely are fairly impermanent. They kind of arise and then disperse, and something else arises, and maybe the same thing that arose a minute ago comes back. But if you think of them as rather as drops that fall and then roll away, we're actually attuning ourselves a bit more to the underlying nature of our thoughts. Um, so just as a drop of water lands and rolls off of the leaf of a lotus, this is peacefulness in equanimity, and that's the line from the Indriya Bhavana Sutra, the teaching on equanimity. So, um, what equanimity often can has been translated by some scholars in some of the texts is as dispassion. Um, it's often with scholars anyway, translations of text, we might see dispassion. And that's actually not a terribly accurate rendition of the context that we're talking about. Equanimity is less about dispassion and more about um, heightened engagement, but without preference. It's a sense that we can remain engaged in the world or within our meditation practice. It's not avoiding, it's not sort of saying, okay, this I don't want, I don't need, but rather it's allowing things to be as they are, remaining engaged with things as they are, and yet not being caught up in preference and aversion. So, if anybody has had that experience where you've been able to rest in the openness of mind, mind being this sort of clear, open, non-reactive state, and if you haven't, that's fine. This is kind of where we're headed in our practice anyway. And that's why we call it a practice, because, there's a process to get there sometimes. Some days are easier than others. But that quality of equanimity is largely highly engaged and very present. It's an aware, sort of conscious presence, but it's not seeking preference. It's not saying, oh, well, this is coming up and I don't want it. I'd rather have this state. But rather, it's almost an openness and an allowing of all things as they are. So it doesn't mean we have to buy into things that we may not agree with intellectually or that may not fit our views. But it is kind of a way of responding. That equanimity is almost that kind of bearing witness with in a neutral way. And that is how it feels when the mind is at rest. It's not quite so jumpy and reactive, and we're able just to bear witness, maybe even with some gentleness and with some compassion to what we're seeing. So equanimity is largely seeing one thought as being very much like another thought. We may feel like we're having a really good thought, like, oh, this would really help. If our society could respond this way, then this would lead to that, and that would be better than if we responded this way, and that led to more suffering, and so on. We may be right about that. We may actually be right on the money there. But what we're really sort of seeking here is a slightly more penetrative perception, less about right and wrong, but more being able to bear witness through the lens of simply seeing cause and effect without judgment. Not so easy to do all the time. And I think especially given the climate that we're in, um, publicly with the virus. But for our well-being, the capacity to sit in a stable way and at least find refuge in being engaged with things as they come, but also being being able to witness in a fairly neutral way, is really helps the mind to settle even deeper into its own relaxed state. In Tibetan, there's a phrase that says that just as water, if you do not stir it, remains clear, so too does the mind find its own way to peacefulness. And so that's really what we're talking about here is using equanimity as a tool to allow the mind simply to find its way to a sense of peacefulness rather than have to work hard to get there. Because as we know, if you work hard to get there, it takes much longer to get there anyway. So we can practice. Last week we practiced with the three kayas, the three bodies, the form body or nirmanakaya, the energy body, or what's called the emanation body, which is the sort of the subtler physiology, the energy body, and also the wisdom body or dharmakaya, which is more of that state that I was just talking about. So what helps us to be in a place of equanimity? What makes it hard to be in equanimity? Those are important questions to be watchful as we practice in meditation. That can then teach us when we get off the cushion and we see kind of what's happening out in the world, to be reminded that equanimity is not dispassion. It's not a lack of caring or a lack of engagement. On the contrary, equanimity allows us to love more deeply. It allows us to engage more effectively without the reactivity, without the filters that otherwise might cause us confusion at some point. And the other thing is that equanimity provides an important balance for compassion. And so often we will see compassion and equanimity as two sides of one thing. That without equanimity, compassion can actually lead to almost an overwhelm of the suffering we may be bearing witness to. It may be our own suffering. And so the equanimity helps to keep us stable. It helps to keep us rooted and solid in our practice. So we need that to balance out the quality of compassion. At the same time, if all we did was practice equanimity without the compassionate part, then we would be at risk of falling into apathy or falling into indifference or this dispassion that some people have labeled equanimity as. So the two are very important and mutually enhancing in that way, and ultimately become one state. If you think about moments where you've felt really able to stand on your heart with strength, you were probably in that really nice balance of compassion and equanimity. The work that I've done doing chaplaincy work that's been invaluable. To be with suffering day in and day out it requires equanimity to still stay focused and attentive and strong and not get swept into the suffering. So one way we can practice equanimity or rather one way is by doing what is called a mountain meditation, which some of you may remember. We've done it before in our group in years past. And I personally feel like this is an utterly lovely practice. Maybe someone has done this before. But meditating on oneself as a mountain, embodying that state of being unmoved but highly present, and in an open way where we're rooted and we're solidly rooted into the earth element. But we're also feeling a sense of being present. We're also feeling a sense of being unmoved. And in a way, that then is the balance that characterizes equanimity. So something that is important for us then to practice and helps us to also remain watchful of where the mind is going. If we're falling into a narrative that causes more angst, more suffering, equanimity is a way to kind of anchor ourselves. After all, it is a state of non-judgment. It's a state of neutrality, but still a very clear witness. This what's in some traditions might be called the neutral witness. In the Advaita Vedanta, which is also very close to my heart, a tradition I've practiced in, the term for that is sakshin. The Sanskrit word is sakshin. Sakshin means that quality of bearing witness in a very vibrant, clear way, but also in a very neutral, kind of non-judgmental way. So whatever we call it, whether we call it bare awareness, sakshin, neutral witness, emptiness, all pointing to the same state of consciousness. And really, it begins with mindfulness. It begins with the quality of being mindful of whatever is arising in the moment, how that's impacting our feelings and our sensations in the body, what comes up, where does it lead us, where's the mind seeking to go. Mindfulness of fighting what comes up or just following it or feeding it energy, the 3 F's. So mindfulness is that first step of being watchful of what is the process that I'm going through right now. It doesn't mean we don't feel. Equanimity doesn't mean we don't feel things, but rather it's a standpoint by which we relate to what comes up. And it's a way to remain unmoved or present in a way that is highly engaged in the midst of our own pain and our own suffering. So a very important term, not often explained, I think, in detail in some of the teachings, but it is there in different forms, also in yoga, in the yoga tradition, in Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation, as well as in Buddhism, of course. So, and the Advaita Vedanta. Now, all of these are important, or rather, equanimity is important to these different traditions to be able to balance that. Anyone who's done an asana yoga class, sometimes maybe your yoga teacher will have you find that center place of neutrality and balance, right? That kind of core rootedness in your posture. And that helps to come with equanimity. One of my favorite yoga postures is tree pose, vrikshasana, which is the one where you stand on one foot, your heel is sort of up in the groin area, and your hands are above your head like this, and you're standing on one leg. And then allowing that center of gravity to find it, and and the mind itself, when it's engaged with a thought, an opinion, a preference, an objective, all of a sudden balance gets off and you start falling one way or the other. If you're like me, your core body isn't that strong anyway, and that doesn't help either. But it's interesting how the mind, on a very subtle level, will sort of throw the balance of the physical body off just a little bit. And so, again, here is that sense of neutral presence, just gently abiding in neutral presence. This is the underlying state of mind. This is the nature of that peacefulness that we're looking for. Otherwise, if it weren't part of our own nature, we'd never be able to get there in our meditation. And so that's the good news, is that it's inherently part of that essence of mind. And it's just very subtle. And when everything else quiets and falls away, that arises more freely. So